What's going on? It's Jason Heath. We're talking today with Andrew Arceci, who is in the historically informed performance world, plays violone, viola da gamba, double bass, and he's been leading groups from the bass or the gamba or the violone. We talk about that and much more. Really hope you enjoy this conversation.
How are you?
Good. It's been a minute. I was trying to remember when we chatted last. I think it was 2019.
I think so.
Not much has happened since then, right?
What a crazy world.
Have you been getting back to doing some playing or anything like that? How are things on your side of the country?
It's been slow. My spring will be busy. But I'm actually in Europe at the moment. I'm doing some work, some research, and
cool.
we're visiting some family. This was a good time to come, despite the pandemic. But the industry, I'm sure we will talk about this when we jump in. But yeah, the industry has just been slammed.
It hasn't been great. I don't know if you can see my bass in the corner right there, but that bass has never left this condo. So we closed in this condo a week before San Francisco went into shelter in place. And so I'm subbing with the symphony in 2 weeks. So it will finally leave. But I played my last gig like March, 10th, 2020, rolled it in here. And except for practicing, it's just sat in that corner. So I had to dig out my wheel. I had to dig out my bass case. I had to make sure I pumped up the wheel. So all good problems, but where are you at in Europe right now?
So I'm in Italy at the moment, but we have family in many places. My wife's sister lives in Zurich, and her parents live in Amsterdam. So and she has other relatives in Japan. So we, certainly before the pandemic, we were traveling for work, but also to visit family. In terms of the scene, I was traveling quite a lot before the pandemic, and I think some of that will come back. It's been very slow. I've done a number of video programs, but my spring, theoretically should be busy.
Nice.
But these days, I think, we're just on hold. So much of what has come in is tentative. Most of the projects that I've been doing and that I will likely be doing in the spring, no one can confirm until we're closer to the dates. Especially with travel, and there's quite a lot of variety, as throughout the country, and especially with international travel. So I think the new routine is to be flexible.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about making a European trip this fall because there is this Dutch double bass festival, and I thought, all right, I've been looking for an excuse to do some Western Europe travel, and then I was chatting with my friend Jeff Chalmers from Discover Double Bass, and just the crazy gyrations he had to go through to get into the U.S., and I just thought, all right, let's just settle down, because I've done a lot of domestic travel. Like I didn't leave this city probably like most people for like a year and 4 months, and then I've done I think like 12 trips in the last few months. So I've been like all over the place, but just domestically. And I thought, all right, I'm just going to hang out for the rest of 20. Like I'll explore. But that's really cool. So what's the feel like in Italy right now? Are things feeling okay or?
The restrictions are very tight. You need a green pass, basically proof of vaccination to do anything inside. So if you want to eat at a restaurant, if you want to enter a theater, a museum, proof of vaccination, everyone is masked. I will be back and forth to the States the next several months, pending COVID. With the festival that I run in Winchton, Massachusetts, we canceled 2020, we canceled 2021, and it's very hard to navigate the future because restrictions vary from one town to the next. Certainly within a state, and then you are looking at different states. And so, that's not a conversation that you and I we can have it, but
it's above our pay grade, probably. Yeah.
But these are conversations that I think officials should have, because it's wildly confusing, especially if you're traveling between different states in the United States. Thankfully, most of the European countries have unified in that way, that you basically need proof of vaccination to do anything.
Okay, yeah. Not unified here. San Francisco sounds like what you're describing, but it's been kind of interesting going all over the country. Like I went to Wabash, Indiana. There's no evidence of pandemic. I don't think I saw a mask the entire time there.
Really?
And then I was sort of surprised. I did a couple trips to Houston. I did a trip to Houston and then to South Texas. And Texas was actually much closer to San Francisco than I was expecting. And then I went to Nashville, Tennessee, which again, it's like they're just letting it rip in Nashville. So not a lot of. So it's been interesting for sure. Well, so I'll make sure to link up to our last chat, but let's just pretend it's 2019 when we were chatting last. Like maybe just like go through for folks like your suite of activities. Like wait, because you have an interesting career, many multifaceted career.
Thank you. Yeah. So I work on viol, violone, and bass across several periods, primarily Renaissance and Baroque, but I do quite a lot with, classical music and contemporary as well. My background is certainly within bass. I was also interested in art history, and through conservatory, I became very interested in earlier styles of playing. And so I started to explore viola da gamba and violone. And then I just naturally fell into that scene. So the last, several years, I have been working throughout the United States and in Europe and elsewhere on these instruments, viol, violone, and bass. In the last several years, I was directing the Collegium Musicum at Wellesley College. So I was, conducting, usually from an instrument, usually from viol or violone, just given the repertoire that we were doing. And trying to balance, an academic gig with freelance work and travel, and then a wife and 2 young children. So I think, the usual freelance career where, jumping between activities. And I love the variety. I've always enjoyed, the travel, but also working with a number of ensembles and working between genres. So I've been lucky that I, have been able to sustain that. With the pandemic, it's very hard to know what that will look like in the future. As I mentioned, the travel certainly was a huge part of period playing. I was usually working between Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and DC, and occasionally in other cities, but that was usually the route between Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and DC. And, that I think some of that will come back, but in terms of flying, in terms of international travel, it's very complicated. Especially if there's quarantine involved. You're trying to tour with an ensemble, and if there's quarantine involved, that's an added expense, and then also the uncertainty to put together a program and then to tour that program. So on a personal level, I don't know what at least my routine will look like in the future. I'm still trying to navigate that, I think, like so many of us.
Yeah, how's that? And we could talk forever about this probably, but how's that been for? Because I also do a lot on the road in a very different way, but and so luckily, just with I've been inadvertently preparing for a pandemic for years is the line I've used, just because I play bass, but that's not like where most of my income comes from, and so it's mostly been like my mental health, just like being locked up inside, and I think you can chart my mental health over the pandemic by the zaniness of my YouTube videos. I think the depth of it, where I started to do these like historical animations, and I just felt like I was losing my mind. And then I've done enough travel to sort of remember what I don't like about travel now. So I think I'm okay with sitting at home for another couple months before 2022 kicks in. But how's that been for you? Because talk about a lifestyle change.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I love your videos. I send them to a number of my students. And part of that, I've always taught, and so I continued teaching. I've done soundtrack work at different times, and so I reconnected with some composers and producers, and so it was a shift, for everyone. Certainly within the performance world, but really, most industries are still shifting to to a new world. And so, yeah, for me, my wife and I would switch off with travel, but one of us was usually traveling. And so that, stopped. And I was on hold actually the week that everything shut down. I was supposed to do a short tour with a group in Philadelphia, and we were supposed to leave the country. So, we were on hold that week. And if I remember correctly, one of the festivals in Germany basically canceled, but we were on hold so they could make the call and that the ensemble wouldn't pull out. And then borders started, closing. And so, I don't think any of us knew. I'm sure the scientists knew, but it was just, those several months, it was very uncertain. And then, we lost 6 months of work within 24 hours. And it was clear. At that point, it was clear that this would be with us for a long time. So, but like I said, we've been lucky that we've been able to teach. I've reconnected with some composers and producers, and so I've been doing some soundtrack work. I've done a few video, programs. One being this program with Arcadia, and this was a long process. I think they accepted applications well before the pandemic. And then Arcadia had a long, process. The application process. And then I think there was at least one, maybe two interviews. And then the three of us, the three finalists, were invited to put together a concert. I think they were holding out to maybe do something live. And then there was a decision to do, these video programs.
Have you gotten a chance to play some live stuff yet? Have you played? Has it been mostly video or been exclusively? Okay.
Yeah, I haven't been in a concert hall. I've done. Yeah, I think everything has been these video programs or live streamed programs. I did something with Boston Baroque months ago, and that was. There were a few people in the studio with us, but it was live streamed. Yeah, so it will be strange to step back into a hall with a audience.
Yeah, it'll probably be fun. For me, June was the first time I actually played. I have played live. I just haven't played that bass live. And I did this bass quartet. And it was funny because I hadn't really left San Francisco, and I got on a flight. And within 45 minutes of getting off in Long Beach, I was like rehearsing a bass quartet. It was like riding a bike. I was like, oh yeah, I know how to do this. And then I had enough to. But it was. And I haven't done any. It sounds like you haven't either. Any of those live pandemic sort of everybody spaced out concerts. I can't help but think that's weird, but it seems like that people have gone away from that largely. So interesting.
Yeah, I wasn't doing too much of that. Most of what I was doing and sort of what I have on on the calendar, nearly everything has been rehearsals and or the recordings or live streamed events, but everyone in the same room, usually masked. But the music making was happening, within the same room, nothing, through like a split screen or anything.
Right. Okay. That's cool.
But, and even, for the last several months, the question of testing, the question of masking, I think there's still a lot of questions about how to navigate that for chamber ensembles, but also, larger ensembles, whether there are any singers. And this came up with the Arcadia program too, because we were back and forth with discussions about, the number of players, whether there could be any woodwinds or vocalists. And so I think at the time, I think it was the right decision to keep it to more or less strings. And everyone was masked. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty, both for organizations, but also for audiences, how to navigate the flow of people, how to navigate whether the venue or the ensemble is requiring proof of vaccination. These conversations, and I think there's quite a lot of variety from one place to the next.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I saw maybe a month ago. I saw Hamilton, and they open, the tour, musical theater opened back up, and so I got in. The bass player got me in, and I saw the preview. It was funny to be back in a completely packed house, and again, San Francisco, everybody's masked and vaccination card, like all the stuff. But yeah, it was interesting to actually see a live. A live show again. It was nice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, we're social beings. I mean, I think that that desire, that need is definitely there. So, I think in the next several months, it will. I hope that I will have a full schedule again.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, for me, 2021 was way busier than I was anticipating. I was fully expecting to sit at home and do nothing. And I had an invite to go to Germany in May. And I wish I had said yes now, but I think I got, even in March of this year, I was thinking that nothing's going to happen. And I thought, do I really want my first time out of the city of San Francisco to be like an international flight, and then just like, is it good quarantine? Am I going to get trapped? Just all that. I should have gone, but it's okay. We'll make it happen in a future time.
Yeah.
So I've started to my background is very much not viol or anything like that, but I did make my first purchase in that sort of world. Basically, I have a Baroque bow.
Fantastic.
From is it Philip Smith? Oh darn, I'm blanking on his name. He's a Tasmanian luthier. My friend George Amarim, who teaches at in South Texas, the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, is really into period performance and is a bit of a bow collector. His office is just filled. And so he had a French Baroque bow, and he thought, Philip's bows are really nice. You're interested? So I got it, and I've been practicing with it, and it's been really interesting. I don't know when I'll actually use it in public. Right now, I've just been practicing Bach with it, and it's been fun going back and forth between my, doling modern French bow and this, and just the sound. And I was playing for my wife, and she's like, wow, the sound is really different, and the feeling is really different. And so I've sort of been an observer of period performance and never really a participant, unless someone's really in a pinch and I come in and like fake it on my modern bass. But it's been fun to kind of dabble in that world a tiny little bit.
Well, and for me, it was like that too. I was just curious, and I started to experiment, with earlier bows and of course, gut strings, and then I just was pulled more and more in that direction. And I still play modern bass and do some contemporary rep. But as I mentioned, I love the variety. I tend to do far more period playing than anything. And, I love research, and I love putting together what I hope are interesting programs, and, weaving a theme or, several themes through a program. There's an art to that, I think. It's not just playing. I think there's an art, there's a skill involved to putting together a program, trying to execute that, trying to coordinate rehearsals, contracts, all of the non-musical elements that are important to not just making a living as a freelance player, but like if you're running something or if you're leading anything. And some of that I was doing some of that with the Collegium at Wellesley. So, I was conducting from usually the viol, but occasionally the violone. And, I was coordinating with students and of course, some of my colleagues on faculty. And I was doing, I really enjoyed that. And I was doing more of that, both at, Wellesley, but also elsewhere. And then with the festival too, I even now, certainly before the pandemic, but I was usually leading several programs. I would have some colleagues come in as well and do solo programs or chamber programs. But each year I usually led one or two programs, pending the repertoire, usually viol or violone, and occasionally, bass. And, I enjoy doing it. I'm not, it's interesting because there's no reason why a violone player or a bass player, can't lead.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, traditionally we think, it's usually the keyboard player,
Right,
or the violinist. And there's good reasoning there too, but there's no reason why, a cellist or a violone player or a bass player couldn't lead. And I think, at least, my perspective is that I think there's a unique viewpoint there, especially playing a continual line. But, often if you're playing a violone part, you may be in and out, gives you a chance to listen, in a different way. And obviously, when you're following the continual line, you have the figures. And so there's sort of this vertical thinking, but also there's a horizontal thinking as well. And, I mean, maybe for some ensembles it works and for others it wouldn't. But I mean, for early repertoire, certainly for Renaissance repertoire, anything like on viol or violone, I think you could lead from any line, any instrument. And with bass, there's sort of the physicality too. I mean, likewise for viol and violone, if you're sitting, I usually stand to play bass. But with the Arceci program, I usually conducted with one hand, or sometimes I would try to lead with my head, but also be ready to play. And I think, there's a unique perspective there when you're, quote, conducting or leading from an instrument as opposed to the baton. You're one of the players.
Yeah, it's interesting, and if folks are just haven't experienced a lot of period performance, early music, and you've seen orchestra concerts, you think leading, oh well, that means a conductor. But then the whole, we could go way down a rabbit hole with this, but I mean was Mendelssohn the first person to kind of codify or codify, but I haven't had enough coffee. I can't remember how to pronounce words, but like, how did the conductor, wasn't that kind of in Mendelssohn's era when the conductor, as we think of it, stick waver became a thing?
Well, I mean, there's certainly, Lully with a staff.
They were like pound on the floor.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, but not, but in general, players were usually, conducting from an instrument. And likewise, I mean, the idea of composition is tied in with that. I mean, this idea of just being a conductor or just being a composer, I mean, that's fairly, I think that's a modern concept, certainly, in the last, plus minus 50 years. Mm-hmm. But I think, all these trades were connected. I mean, learning to play an instrument or several instruments, learning theory, learning, to conduct, but by conducting, you're leading usually from an instrument, certainly with earlier genres, but also the idea of composing or arranging or rearranging, it was all connected. And I'm just like fascinated by that thinking, because I think, for instance, with earlier styles, the trajectory is important. So, if you're approaching Mozart from Bach, Handel, that is a very different way to approach Mozart or Haydn than looking back through, Brahms, Beethoven, that tradition, right? So, and I think that way of thinking is important. Having sort of a forward trajectory, I think that's important, but I think that this idea that these skills are connected, it was I think understood, and I appreciate that that we live in a very different world. It's very competitive. Conservatory these days, right? Conservatory is wildly competitive. Any major audition is wildly competitive. And so, composition, conducting, all these specialties are very competitive. But I do think that there's something to be learned, trying to arrange or trying to compose. It gives you a different understanding. When you're looking at a blank page, realizing that someone like Bach or any great composer actually put, those notes down on the page. And, trying to do that makes you appreciate it, hopefully at a different level, just like trying to conduct from an instrument or, so I'm attracted to those, those situations.
Yeah, well, that's the way, it's like we were describing. That's the way music has mostly been. Like if you look at go look at Bach's joyless letters about money, that he would like, and listen, or just like the entrepreneur musician is like that. That's kind of the standard, and actually in some ways, freelancer is kind of the default, and jack of all trades to a certain extent is all. And boy, as someone who our Venn diagrams overlap a bit in that I got into conducting and I got into arranging, especially when I was doing more teaching. It really made me appreciate my perspective from the bass more. It made me, actually trying your hand at I do a little composing, not really, mostly arranging, but it makes you realize oh wow, it sort of gives you a connection to the music that you might not have, if you just exclusively perform. You kind of put people up on a pedestal, and then you realize that it's performing the music, conducting the music, all the business aspects that you were describing, creating programs, arranging rehearsals. There's so much that goes into a musical career. One of my friends, and then I'll shut up, I promise. But one of my Garrett Hope, I've had him on the podcast several times. He has a podcast called The Portfolio Composer, and that's just sort of the whole thrust of that podcast is this is the way most of us make our way in the music world. And even if you do have a salaried job, there's still a high likelihood that you have a portfolio of sorts, that you're doing things outside of that, and you are going to have to or want to arrange rehearsals, concerts, programs, all that sort of thing. So these are all parts of being a musician, and they have been for a long time, I think.
Definitely. I agree with you. I think they've been with us for a long time.
The whole leading thing from the bass is super interesting, or just leading from an instrument. You're taking me back to like the late '90s when I was playing in the Civic Orchestra of Chicago and Daniel Barenboim conducting from the piano, and then I've played just enough Baroque gigs to get me in trouble, like conductorless, kind of like filling in sort of things. But it is interesting, like so you are conducting sometimes. You are actually with your hands at times.
Yeah, pending the situation, of course, and pending the instrument. But yeah, I will usually use one hand to conduct. Sometimes I'll use, the bow, and other times, use my head. But I also think it's important to have a relationship with, especially if you're doing chamber music, and even chamber orchestral music. We could go a number of directions. We could talk about, just getting parts, together, because obviously, if you're playing a string instrument, you can't turn like a keyboard player, right? You can't turn the pages the same way. And so trying to organize parts, or trying to write in cues, or to memorize cues, because that's part, right? That's a huge part of leading, to make sure that, that everyone is comfortable. And I think having, there are a number of decisions that a leader needs to make, but also some of those decisions can be made collectively. So for instance, with Arcadia, I put together the program, and we were exploring Italian music and really how Italian music spread outside of Italy. So we included Corelli and Vivaldi, but we also included some other composers, less known composers, who, some were missionary musicians who traveled to, various parts of the globe. But I certainly had ideas, and, in the rehearsal, some of those ideas changed. A large part of, I think, any directorial position is, solidifying a program, and then trying to coordinate rehearsals, knowing how to run rehearsals, making sure that, colleagues are comfortable with the repertoire, but also, the flow, any musical decisions. And, we certainly had discussions as a chamber ensemble. I tried to, most of these situations, you never have enough time. But in terms of parts, for instance, I I tried to collate my parts in a way that made sense for me, but also I used a combination of parts and scores. And I also wrote in certain cues. I also memorized some cues. So for instance, if I wasn't playing, that I could, use my hands to cue.
Mm-hmm.
And with some of these works, it was mostly, trying to start a movement, trying to think of creative ways, textures, etc., both within a piece, but also a larger program. So, for instance, the Arceci program, I think it is fairly varied. I played viol, violone, and bass on the program, but we did a violin sonata. We also featured the harpsichord in one set. We also featured the theorbo player in another set. And so I'm really interested in textures. And I think part of that comes from playing continuo and, thinking about some of the music in a different way than, say, a violinist may or a keyboard player may. And another component too, I don't want to just kind of ramble, but I think another component of the directorial aspect is, knowing when to back off. And, this program that I did with Arcadia, and I think most programs, it's not, the program wasn't about me. Like for instance, I didn't include any concerti on the program. I tried to think of an interesting program, a musically interesting program, but also trying to weave a theme together, trying to find interesting repertoire that people may know and finding other repertoire that people may not know. So I think there's a balancing act, just like there's a balancing act of trying to get people in the door. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the entertaining aspect, right? It's not just doing obscure repertoire that people may or may not care about.
Yeah, that's tricky, right? The whole it's a whole art to that as well.
Yeah. So and I think I've done some of this through the festival, but I think there is a very fine balance, and I think one needs to know one's audience too, because for certain venues, if you're presenting at a musicology conference, right? That is a very different scene than a general a general audience, a general concert to a general audience. And I think knowing how to shift, having flexibility, but also trying to stay true to the music making, right? And the historical differences, the historical elements that I think make this music interesting.
Yeah.
So, it's there's a lot there.
Yeah, the whole parts thing is interesting, like just managing your part, and I played for about 15 not enough coffee again, 15 years in a chamber music festival. And if I would look back at my parts there, primarily string quintet or maybe with a few woodwinds, and you'd see that I'd have this sort of, code of like writing in cues all over the place. And then in more recent years I moved over to doing almost everything on the iPad, which sort of seems like the opposite of what you want to do in a peer. I don't know if people use iPads, but and then the whole playing off of, and this is different if you're conducting the group, but I heard a really interesting conversation on Noah Kageyama's, am I getting his name right? The Bulletproof Musician, wonderful podcast. I'm forgetting his guest, but his guest, she was talking about, she's a violist, I believe, in a string quartet for years and years. And she would always play off scores all the time. And then one day she realized she started playing on parts exclusively then, just the viola part, because she realized she was like she was imagining the music in her head, looking at the score and not actually listening to what was going on. And so that's interesting. So it's a whole pile of topics right there. But do people, I guess my question is, do people use the iPad in any capacity in the type of music you play?
Yeah, I know a number of colleagues who do. I haven't made the shift yet. I've been thinking about it for a long time, just in terms of trying to cut and paste a part, writing in figures.
Yeah, I mean the practicality of it is tremendous. Like I got deep into it, and I think it started in 2017, and it's kind of like every piece becomes a bundle of information, and I can keep versions and I can keep notes, and it's been just great. But that's me, and I know that not everybody likes to work that way, and there is something the danger I have found, which has only happened to me a couple times, is you lose your sense of place, or I do with the iPad, because it's just like this device, versus if you're in a score, you're at the beginning of the score, you're on the left page, the right page, you're at the end of the score. So you're just like staring at this piece of glass. And if you screw up, you can just get lost. Like you go backwards when you're supposed to go forwards. So those are the only disadvantages really, or if you like lose it or break it. But that can happen.
Or if it's not charged. I was backstage.
Yeah.
Well, no, but a number of colleagues have shifted into that. I haven't. I just, as you were, saying some of that, I was just reminded of a story. I was backstage, and someone she hadn't charged the iPad and was trying to find a charger, and it was like 10 minutes before. It was like 10%, and I mean, I think it's it seems like it would be an incredible tool. So I've been thinking about making the shift for the Arcadia program, and for most of the programs, especially if I'm leading, I use a combination of parts and scores, and sometimes even within the same movement, I'll cut and paste. Mm-hmm. If there's a section or a movement that I think the score is more useful, especially if there are a number of cues. So I may, and just visually, it's weird, especially if you're looking at one line of music and then you turn the page and then you have a score, and you're between clefs. And so with any of this, I think like anything, it takes practice. And I had to learn how to navigate my own parts, because I don't know many players or conductors who are, conducting from viol, violone, or bass. And so I was trying to find ways that were useful for myself, but also useful for colleagues, especially if someone's relying on me to give the cue, right? Yeah. And so I needed to find ways, and I think part of that was just experimenting. Using a part and trying to memorize the cues, or using a part and writing in the cues, or using the score. But then, of course, you have more page turns, mm-hmm. Or trying to reduce the score. And for me, and it very much depends on the situation and the ensemble, but I think I have found a combination of the part and the score, pending, the movement or, the work. And I usually have the part and the score in case I have, you're in rehearsal and something doesn't work and you need to make some changes. And so, maybe an iPad would be easier in that sense. But for the Arcadia program and for all the programs that I've led, I usually cut and paste the parts that work for me. Mm-hmm. And if I returned to some of that rep, I probably would do something very, differently. I don't know. I have come back to a few things, and I will sometimes redo a part that makes more sense, or maybe we'll think about it differently, and then we'll redo the part and or the score pending, what's needed.
Yeah.
It's a very different way of thinking about like playing and performing, because, you're not just, and I don't want to use that language, but, as a violone or a bass player, you're usually to the side, and it's a very different way of making music. And, I'm not saying that any leader needs to be in the middle. You can easily lead from the side, or, that varies depending the ensemble and certainly the venue and the repertoire, of course, too. But I think there's a very different way of making music and thinking about music from viol, violone, and or bass. And I've really enjoyed exploring that world, and I've been lucky that I've been able to lead some programs. I suppose you should ask my colleagues if it works or not.
Oh, I'm sure it works great. It's interesting having that foundational perspective, like coming from the bass line. And I think, I have all these theories on, but I think, I notice a lot of bass players, and it could be just because I talk to bass players for this show, so I might be biased, but so many people seem to embrace other roles. And I do wonder if you're that observational, nature, you're taking on the big structures. You oftentimes don't have as many notes, frankly, as some of the other instruments, so you're able to think a little bit more like a conductor, or you're to see the big picture. And it's really interesting thinking about score preparation or part preparation with a leadership role in mind. You're taking me back to, like, I would do a lot of guest conducting back when I lived in Chicago, and I would take a very different approach to looking at a score than if I was going to, like, go play in a bass section or something like that. And I know that's different than period performance, where you're generally, it's you or maybe another bass player if you're playing Messiah or something. But it's just so. I would look for structures. I had my whole system. For the type of music I was doing, I would put measure numbers everywhere just because I wanted to be prepared for everything. And I came up with my own system of cues, what I thought might happen, and just so that I had as much information at hand before I walked in there. And again, very different than how I approach a bass part if I'm not the leader.
Definitely. And with some of this earlier repertoire, the 16-foot player, whether you're playing violone or bass, is often in and out. I mean, pending, the textures that are either, suggested or that you can use. And I think you're right that it gives you a very different perspective. And I think it's good to, we all love to play. And I think it's also important to know, what, actually that movement works better without 16 foot, or, and that's an important awareness, I think, that a conductor, needs to make. But, when you're playing, the listening is also very different too, because, you're trying to play, you're trying to listen as you would as a player with, especially from continuo with the cellist and, or, the bassoon player or any pluck players, the keyboard player. And so you're listening, in that way. But I think, there are also times when you have to listen to the collective sound, and whether or not, if there are tuning issues, if there are any wrong notes, if there are, bowing issues, if there are ensemble issues, and textural issues. And so there's a very different way of not just the preparation, but I think also being in the moment and thinking. And it's, you have one ear with what you're doing, and then you try to have another ear with the ensemble. Just like you have, one eye on the music, and then, maybe another eye on the collective, ensemble.
Yeah, for sure. I did something back when I was conducting. This might not work with professionals for a variety of reasons, but I would record every single rehearsal I did. And part of it was I had this super long commute, so I would listen back in the car. But it was so interesting to what I thought I was hearing when I was in the thick of it, and I was in battle, and like trying to diagnose problems and do this, and I wasn't even playing. That's like yet another variable versus listening. But certainly you've listened back to concerts that you've been the leader of. Do you ever get surprised after you pull yourself out and you just become a listener? Any takeaways you've had?
Of course. I mean, it's the same with any recording project. I mean, it's a great opportunity to listen back. And there are times when you think, that didn't work, or I should have done that, or that wasn't clear, or any of those. Those situations. In terms of balance, sometimes I'll put the instrument down and then try to listen, but also if, someone else is there, you hope that you have someone with good ears and you trust, whether it's a colleague or someone with the organization. But also I think, very rarely will someone be at a concert and think, the balance was, it is what it is in terms of the room. It's not a tweaked recording. I think, balance is important, but I think in general, especially now, since we've been through this pandemic and it's not, it's not done.
We're getting
this idea of, as musicians, as artists, we tend to obsess. At least I, obsess about, runs or details. And I think that, of course, that's very important. And I remember in New York, Monica Huggett, the great violinist, she made a comment about, a run. I don't remember if it was like someone's solo or just an ensemble, run. And, obviously we wanted to nail it, but she was trying to communicate that most people just want to be moved, right? I mean, they want to be entertained, but they also want to be moved. And I think it's easy to forget.
Yeah.
When we're trying to, obsess about tuning or an ensemble issue or whatever. I mean, playing music is hard. I mean, playing live, I mean, anything can happen. But I think, this idea that people want to be entertained, they want to be moved. If there's a story involved, I mean, I think all of that is really important, especially now. I steered away from your question, but I think, listening back, I mean, I think all of that is very important in terms of, trying to think through creative ways and trying to think through balance issues, et cetera. But I also think it's good to try to take a step back in as a player, but also as an audience person.
Oh, yeah.
Right, about the experience.
Right. Yeah, we're used to fetishistically polishing the details to perfection, and then it's like you go, but did it move you or did it not? No, I mean those are the big questions. It's so you brought up something earlier that I think is really interesting. Did you say that you do some contemporary music playing as well?
Yeah.
Okay. So apologies if I asked you this a couple of years ago, but it's just a topic. So like I've noticed so many people that are into historical performance, period performance, whatever word, and contemporary music. And it takes me back to like the early 90s working at the Northwestern Listening Center. And I remember I was talking to somebody who was maybe a musicology grad student. I don't remember what he was exactly, but he came in and he's like, as long as it's not from the Romantic era, it's okay. What have you speculated? Have you noticed a correlation between people who are into early music and contemporary music, and have you speculated why?
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I love music from the Romantic era.
Yeah, me too.
I don't play as much of it. I mean, I still, play some.
Yeah.
But I mean, I love Chopin. I never play his music, but I just love, the writing and my grandfather was a pianist. But I mean, I think that, maybe there's some flexibility in the music making. I mean, it's a very different approach in terms of Renaissance, Baroque, and period playing. I mean, it's less unusual now than it was, but I think there's a very different approach. Just like with contemporary rep, I mean, I think there's experimentation involved. And I think maybe I mean, I don't know, but for me, I've always enjoyed experimenting, with bows, with strings, with ways of thinking, about music, et cetera. And so maybe there's some truth in that, where it's the experimentation that people, I mean, and that's not to say that you can't experiment with Romantic, music. I mean, I think that, I don't do as much contemporary, but there's something, whether you're working with a composer or not, there's something maybe invigorating or, being part of sort of that process.
Yeah. And
in a similar way, I mean, obviously somewhat different, but, when you're looking at an original score, and someone's, I mean, it's very, it's just incredible to like look at, an old score and just to think about that history. I mean, imagine someone writing, these notes and that this music is still with us, and that it still means something.
Yeah. It's like you have to be a little bit more of a musical detective when you're looking at something from hundreds of years ago, totally different era, and Cornel Lecomte, this wonderful bassist, period performance player in Brussels. He and I were chatting earlier this year or last year or something. And he said something like, the more we learn about these composers, the less certain we are of anything. He was talking about, Renaissance, Baroque, and particularly Renaissance or just earlier styles. And so just not being certain maybe is that like when you get a new piece of music, like, what does this mean? Like there's sure, there's some of that in Strauss, I guess, but there's much more, I would imagine, when you're talking about instruments from a different era, strings from a different era, bows from a different era. There's probably a flexibility and curiosity in trying to figure out what was happening back then.
Definitely. And I think there's also maybe an element of, looking at the world just in terms of a larger idea. or ideas with some of this that there are many ways to approach the world, right? And when you're looking back at Lu Li or Beethoven or Mendelssohn or any of these composers, I mean, there are very different views about, of course, music, but about looking at the world. Mm-hmm. And I think if I wasn't doing something in the arts, I think it would be anthropology. And so nice. There is this I try to find a human element with a lot of the programs that I put together. I mean, I think finding a story is really interesting, but not just for the sake of the story. Like, for instance, this program with Arcadia is about migration and how musicians traveled and how they were exposed to different cultures, and I love that part of exploring these composers, but also sort of the music making around that too. So yeah, I mean, maybe I should have done something with anthropology, but I try to pull some of those ideas surrounding anthropology into the music making. And I mean, I studied art history too, so I'm pulled to the visual, and I think there's a lot of information in the visual aesthetic that we can get. And so I try to combine these interests when thinking about the music making. Because it is still relevant. I mean, it's we can look at an old painting and appreciate, and we may think about it differently, but it's still you can appreciate the art, but you can also appreciate the story around it. And I try to think of that with music making as well.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's so easy to look back in time and everything looks so neat and tidy. Like, we are in the classical era. That's not what you're thinking at the time. You're in it, and there's war and famine and disease and all the chaos of life, and there's art and music and so it's really interesting. The more you can contextualize what was happening, the more connection you have. And it's just music's just one of those things that's so interesting. Like, we don't have photographs from 1750. We don't have, but we do have, and we have writing, and we have painting, but to have something at this durational art that you are experiencing, probably, hopefully fairly close to what they were experiencing a few hundred years ago. It's one of those things. Talk about bringing history to life. I mean, that's kind of what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to reference. I mean, yes, I mean, there are some difficulties using, old bows or gut strings, but I think it's worth preserving, just like we preserve, other works of art. I mean, in terms of preserving the music, I mean, the music is nothing on the page, right? I mean, and so, maybe in 50 years, we'll think differently about some of this repertoire. But my thinking about this repertoire has changed, certainly from conservatory to the work that I've done, but also trying to conduct from an instrument. I mean, it really is. It's just fascinating, and I certainly enjoy doing it. There are certainly difficulties, though. Like I mentioned, trying to listen in a different way, but also, knowing when to play and when not to.
Yeah, right.
In terms of trying to make something interesting, and again, you have to take a step back, because it's you're one of many, and you have to be I think in this case, obviously, if you're leading, you have to lead, but you also have to take a step back and realize that there's an ensemble, and you have to trust your colleagues. You have to know when to rely, on your colleagues, when to maybe feature the colleagues. And I think, there are a lot of decisions involved, and some of those decisions are dictated by, a board or the finances, or it could be anything, right? I mean, but that, I mean, in terms of conducting from an instrument, it's been a wild journey, and I hope to continue with some of it. I mean, being able to to shape a bass line can really influence an ensemble.
Yeah.
Especially with the earlier repertoire. But I mean, but again, there's no reason. It's certainly less conventional, but there's no reason why a violone player couldn't lead.
Yeah. Well, it's great that you're doing that, and it's great to hear that as we close out the pandemic year number 2. It's great to hear that 2022. It looks like some things are some in-person engagements are coming on the calendar. And if your travels, it sounds like you got a lot of East Coast and then going back and forth between Europe. If you do make it out here to the Bay Area, please let me know. It'd be great to hang out. I'll let you know if I'm in your neck of the woods. And I'll make sure to link up. I'll link up to what you sent along. I'll link up to our last chat so folks can check it out. Anywhere else you want me to send people?
Well, the Arceci program will be released this Saturday, I think, 7 p.m. Eastern time. So this was the program that I led with them. And I can send you some other links. I can send you that link, and then if you want any links to the festival, the Winchester Music Festival.
Cool. Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure what we'll be doing. I mean, it's it takes a long time to plan, these programs, and certainly coordinating the grants, and it's just COVID has made it very difficult. So I don't know what the future will be with this small festival that I run, but hopefully we can do something.
Yeah.
Andrew, thanks for chatting. Folks, check out what Andrew's up to in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.